Did she have to do like financials by herself? Or what do they have there?
Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome. And I'm sure you're very excited about spring break. Right, you have a whole week off next week. Some of us don't get that off, but that's okay. So I'm Dr. Minna Zafridi. I'm in religious studies, and I teach Islam and the Holocaust, and I also am the director of the Holocaust Genocide and Interfaith Education Center. So welcome, and I want to say that we have an event coming up in partnership with Riverdale Y on March 21st. It's an interfaith iftar. Iftar is the breaking of fast for Muslims. Ramadan begins on Monday. Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset. And so a lot of interfaith partners have come together to do that together, especially right now at this time of conflict that's going on. And when Ramadan ends, we hope to have an interfaith vigil standing side by side for peace between Jews, Muslims, Christians, and campuses across the country. So if you want to register for the March 21st, it's on the hdImanhattan.com website, and you can go on there and register. It's $10. If you can't afford it as a student, I will pay for you, so let me know. Okay, so without further ado, I'm very excited that my friend here, Wolf, Dr. Wolf Gruner, who I've known for some years now. He's from USC, but he's also part of this wonderful consortium that we put together in 2017. It's a consortium of Holocaust, human rights, and genocide studies for higher ed directors on higher ed campuses. So a lot of directors get together once a month. We have had daily, monthly meetings for the last few years, and we're a bunch of really good friends and colleagues, all the way from California to New York, but to Alabama, Colorado. It's an amazing, amazing group, and we support each other, we network, and sometimes we just chat, even during COVID, and even during this difficult time for a lot of us navigating what's going on in the world. Wolf is extremely accomplished, and it's nice to have accomplishment with humanity. And he's a very humane person and a very generous and kind person. So I really want to welcome him. His talk tonight is Resistors, How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Hitler's Germany. He holds the Chappell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and is professor of history at the University of Southern California, founding director of the USC Dorn's Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And I heard the beginnings of this center tonight, which is very interesting to me. He received his Ph.D. in history from the Technical University of Berlin and was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, Yad Vashem, Jerusalem, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Women's Christian University, Tokyo, among others. Gruner is the author of 10 books on the Holocaust, including Jewish Forced Labor under the Nazis' Economic Needs and Nazi Racial Aims. His 2016 prize-winning German book was published in English as The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, Czech Initiatives, German Policies, Jewish Responses. He co-edited 4 books, including Resisting Persecution, Jews and Their Partitions During the Holocaust, and New Perspectives on Kristallnacht, after 8 years. And what I really want to hear about is his book tonight, which is Resistors, How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Hitler's Germany. And it's a book that I think is very unique, very important, because it changes the story. It gives a different light to who Jews were, even if they were victims. And still, to this day, although there's a lot of work and scholarship done on resistance, we know very little about it. So thank you, Wolf, for your unique work, and welcome.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Minas, for this really wonderful and friendly introduction. And it's good to be back because the consortium Minas was talking about had a conference here which was hosted by Minas 2 years ago now? Is it 2
Yeah,
years
it
already?
was just after COVID. Yeah, it was just after COVID.
So, what I want to do in this presentation is I will first share one story from the book with you, and then I will talk about why we didn't really acknowledge kind of individual Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, and then kind of elaborate a little bit on the reasons for this neglect. And then towards the end, I will give you a brief, rough overview about different forms of individual resistance with some examples from the book. So let me first talk about Hans Oppenheimer. He was a 17-year-old Jewish adolescent in Frankfurt. It is the year 1940, so that means it is the year already the Second World War had started. Nazi Germany had already occupied Poland and France. So in the fall of 1940, Hans Oppenheimer leaves his house every night. And he does this by breaking the curfew which was enacted for Jews a year earlier at the beginning of the war. When he went out every night, he walked through pitch black kind of darkness because Frankfurt, the city, had ordered a brownout because of the Allied bombing raids, which had already started, mainly coming from Britain. So he went out every night and waited for the Allied bombers to circle in on Frankfurt. And when they dropped their bombs and the fire alarm kind of sirens started to blare, he rushed to the next fire alarm post and set off the wrong fire alarm. And the purpose was to divert the firefighters from the actual burning houses to the street where he was in. So he did this not only once, he did this several times. So how did he get there to make this decision? So he was a firstborn son of a merchant family. His father was a kind of selling tailor accessories in Frankfurt. The family had a good life. They lived in a big apartment on an imposing boulevard in Frankfurt West End, where a lot of Jewish families lived. And in 1933, when Hitler took power, he graduated from elementary school, and his parents kind of recognized the danger of the Nazis coming to power and put him in, or enrolled him in, a Jewish private school, which was one of the most famous private Jewish schools in Germany, the Philanthropic. And this school was able to shield a little bit the Jewish students from this increasing kind of persecution which happened all over Germany. So when he graduated from middle school in 1937 with very good grades, he decided not to go to high school, but to actually do an apprenticeship. And he did this for two reasons. The one was a short-term reason, because his family, his father has lost his business because of the increasing persecution against the Jews in Frankfurt. And Frankfurt was one of the most quickly hostile places in Germany, where the Frankfurt mayor immediately cut off ties to Jewish businesses, where in 1936 Frankfurt was the first city to reduce welfare benefits for Jews, for poor Jews, and where the city was also one of the forerunners in Aryanization or expropriation of Jewish real estate, Jewish private foundations, and also Jewish art collections. So he wanted to help to sustain his family by getting kind of skills in a job he could kind of do later on, or perform later on. The second reason was that because of the increasing persecution, he felt that he would not have a future in Germany. So he thought about getting these skills so that he had a better chance to emigrate from Germany to a country like the United States, Palestine, or other countries in the world. So he did an apprenticeship as a blacksmith in a Jewish school, which was just founded exactly for the purpose of preparing Jewish teenagers for immigration. So when he finished the apprenticeship, he registered at the labor office. And in Germany, there's a kind of labor offices where important because they not only kind of offered employment and distributed employment possibilities, but they also organized the kind of unemployment benefit system. So he registered to get a job to sustain his family. However, at this moment when he registered, there was already an early forced labor program in place. And this was before the war even started. It was a forced labor program for unemployed Jews. So exactly people like Hans Oppenheimer, who was only 17 years old, actually at this point 16 years old. So they put him on a train to a labor camp, one of the very first labor camps in this early forced labor program. In the summer of 1939, this labor program had already kind of extended to a degree that 20,000 Jewish men in Germany were performing forced labor at road constructions, garbage removal, all kind of manual, heavy, dirty labor, which was supposedly good for Jews. He worked several months in this labor camp, was then transferred to another labor camp, which was 17 miles distant from his hometown. And he would not see his family for almost a year, because at the time, Jewish forced laborers did not get vacations. They were kind of deprived of all benefits kind of in the labor system. But also because the mayor of the small town was extremely anti-Semitic. So he segregated the Jewish forced laborers from the kind of inhabitants of the town. He even ordered beatings to supposedly enhance their productivity. The situation was so bad for the forced laborers that one of the men committed suicide in this labor camp. And think about it, he was 17 years old at the time. He comes back from this labor camp to Frankfurt, and this is the moment when he decided to do something. So he went off every night, broke the curfew, set off wrong fire alarms, sometimes even twice. So he waited, kind of hidden in an entrance, till the firefighters appeared, waited till they left when they kind of realized there was no burning house, and then he set off the wrong fire alarm again. Yeah? So unfortunately, he was caught because the Gestapo got a hold of him because the fire posts he used, or the fire alarm posts, were all close to his home. You can imagine when there was a curfew, there were people patrolling, and they were looking for Jews breaking the curfew. So he would not kind of dare to go far from his home. So they could kind of circle in on several posts, and that's how they got him caught. How they caught him red-handed. He was arrested, put in pre-trial detention, and then in April 1941, the main prosecutor in Frankfurt charged him with several felonies according to the German Criminal Code, and for offenses under the war decree against public vermins, Volksschädling. The written indictment emphasized that Hans Oppenheimer was a full Jew, and the indictment pointed out that he, according to the assessment of the Gestapo, was a lazy boy, that he was unstable and a dishonest human being, and that he was eager to destroy things. Under the interrogation by the Gestapo, he only had admitted to 9 wrong fire alarms. However, the prosecutor suspected that he actually committed way more than this, because there was a series of wrong fire alarms, in total numbering 44 incidents. 44, within a span of several months. after he arrived, and the series ended with his arrest. You can imagine what this means. So, in the end, there was a trial, and he was punished as a public vermin. Fortunately, the judge did not follow the prosecutor's demand to apply adult law because he was was 17 years old, under 18, when he committed the wrong fire alarms. But the judge also emphasized in his verdict that as a Jew, Hans should have followed the rules, the German rules, because he was a guest in Germany. Although he had German citizenship, he was born in Germany. But this was the kind of ideology of the Nazis at the time. He was transferred to prison, and his sentence was 3 years in prison. In prison, from the first day on, he was held in solitary confinement. And you can imagine what this means when you are 18 years old, being 3 years kind of in isolation. He had to do prison labor, folding envelopes and bags, day in, day out. And the conditions in the prison were so dire that he got depressed, and the only lifeline he had were kind of letters to his family. And he kind of begged them to come visit him, to bring medication because he kind of developed several illnesses, teeth cavities, because there was no health care for him in prison. But he didn't know that some of these messages never arrived at his parents' home because the prison warden confiscated them, and this is why I got a hold of him, because I found the prison file in the German archive. His health deteriorated very quickly. The conditions took an emotional and physical toll on him, so bad that he actually attempted twice suicide in prison. Unsuccessfully, because prison guards kind of saved his life twice. However, still under these conditions, he petitioned the warden because of these kind of really horrible conditions for him. And this somehow got to his parents, and they begged him to kind of calm down, not to be rebellious in prison, to not kind of increase the severity of the prison conditions. So he wrote to his parents in a letter and said, I quote, "You know best that I never had the chance to visit a cinema, a theater, or a cabaret. So you can imagine that when I think about my life, I can go crazy." So at the end, nearly to the end of his prison time, there was an agreement between the Reich Justice Ministry and the head of the SS to remove all Jewish prisoners in Germany to concentration camps, which meant deportation to the Auschwitz camp in occupied Poland. He did not survive for long in Auschwitz. Only after a few weeks his death was recorded on January 30th, 1943. This was mere days after he turned 20 in his life. So what does the story of Hans Oppenheimer tell us about individual responses towards the Nazi persecution? During the Third Reich, the Nazis in their reports often complained about the so-called impudent Jews. In March 1935, the Gestapo in Aachen reported that, quote, "The number of Jews who had sent letters and protested in person has become quite numerous, and in their tone often impudent." End of quote. And still during the war, in 1940, the Reich Main Security Office of the SS emphasized that it had received information from all corners of the Third Reich about the impudent attitude of Jews against the regime. Historians like myself, we always thought these kind of, the mentioning of the impudent Jews was just a pretext to kind of introduce new radical measures against the Jewish population. But no, there was a grain of truth in it. Because in July 1935, the Gestapo in Berlin emphasized in their report that Jews were born with disrespect for state authority. The same month, more than 100 Jews were arrested in Berlin for offenses against the German state. So you can make the equation here. Later, still during the war, we have 1,200 Jewish men and women in 1942 imprisoned for attacks against the Nazi state, political offenses, and other crimes. This was 2% of the remaining Jewish population, which, when we translate this, for example, to the population of the United States with 330 million, it would mean that 6 million people would be in jail for resistance. Yeah, that's kind of the relation, 6 million. So what I mean is, my research shows that these frequent complaints about the impudent Jew point to a forgotten reality of widespread acts of individual resistance. During the last decade, my systematic research revealed that hundreds and hundreds of Jewish men and women resisted against the Nazi persecution. And I think this fact really demands a reassessment of Jewish reactions and responses towards Nazi persecution. This research strongly challenges the idea of a Jewish passivity during the Holocaust. But why is there this kind of notion of Jewish passivity? And I think there are two main reasons for this. One is that we had a very narrow definition what resistance is. And the other reason is that there was a lack of actual sources from which we can draw these kind of insights. So let me briefly touch upon the narrow approach. Since 1945, historians have discussed Jewish resistance mostly in terms of organized resistance and armed resistance. And it only happened not in Germany, but in Eastern Europe, in occupied Poland, or the occupied Soviet Union. And for this reason, a systematic evaluation of individual kind of resistance never really took place in the Holocaust literature. And even the kind of standard works which are highly acclaimed, including Jewish voices like by Saul Friedlander, never systematically looked into this element of individual resistance. So what I tried to do in my research was to broaden up the concept of what resistance is. And I'm not very unique. I use actually earlier approaches from, for example, a survivor in Israel, Meir Dvoretsky, who already in the 1950s talked about day-to-day resistance, which was not organized but individual. But then also an Australian historian, Konrad Creed, an East German survivor, Helmut Eschwege, they all try to open up the definition of resistance towards individual actions. So this allows us, when we do this, to include non-conformity, defiance, disobedience of laws, and also public protest to include in our view of resistance. Similar ideas were already raised when we talked in the 1980s about Nazi resistance or resistance against the Nazis in general, but also, for example, here in the United States, when people, scholars talked and discussed resistance against slavery, for example. So what I did in my work is one very simple thing. I use a very common definition by a prominent Israeli historian, Yehuda Bauer, and I added just the word individual. And I think this kind of changes dramatically our perspective. And I want to illustrate this just with some images, how we can reread images in this kind of perspective. So this picture I always use, or is always used to illustrate the early wave of Nazi terror. And you can find this in a lot of books. And you see in the center a Jewish lawyer who is dragged by stormtroopers through the city of Munich. However, when you look closer, you see that he actually wears a sign, and on the sign it says in German, "I won't complain at the police station anymore." So that meant this was not a random act of terror, it was a deliberate, targeted act of violence against somebody who had protested at a police station. Or, look at this picture. I used this picture in my class to illustrate the initiative role of city governments, for example, to exclude Jews from public facilities. And you see here the entrance of the swimming pool. But now, under this kind of new perspective, look at her body language. Why is she even taking a picture from herself in front of this kind of humiliation that she can't get into the swimming pool? Or, look at this picture. This was taken by the son of this Jewish family, standing in front of their home, where just days before, Nazis had painted one of the most notorious anti-Jewish slogans. Why would they let the son take a picture of this? And then, my favorite picture is this one. This is Lizzie Rosenfeld in Vienna, and she is sitting on a park bench which is forbidden for Jews. And she's not only sitting, also with kind of, look at her pose, right? But she's also letting her friend taking a picture of this act of disobedience, and she smuggles the negative out several months later when she immigrated to the United States, and this is how we got it now today in the Holocaust Museum in DC. But taking picture itself could be an act of defiance, like in this case, or in this case, where the owner of a Jewish department took a picture of the destruction during Kristallnacht in his private home. This is documenting Nazi crimes. This is an act of resistance. So, in my book, in a way, I try to kind of bring up a very different perspective of resistance, and I will share this in a second with you, how I kind of use 5 different categories. But first, I want to just briefly touch upon the question of sources. So why were there not earlier attempts kind of going into the archives and finding these individual acts? Mostly what historians did were using 3 types of sources. One was reports by the Gestapo, the SS, and they didn't really want to report about Jewish resistance because the idea was Jews were weak, right? So they wouldn't highlight resistance. Second, they used diaries, Jewish diaries, or letters. But in diaries and letters, Jews often feared censorship, that kind of the Gestapo would raid their house, so they couldn't actually write in their diary or in their letters about acts of resistance. So these sources leave out a lot of what actually happened. So what I did in my research, I went to local archives in Germany and I used police records about arrests of Jews, court records about trials against Jewish resistors, and then I added 170 interviews from the USC Shoah Foundation Legal History Archive as kind of a complementary source. And with this material, which nobody had ever used for this purpose, I found all of these cases of individual resistance. So let me share with you what kind of types of resistance I could kind of come up with when I looked over these hundreds and hundreds of different cases I found. So we have disobedience, challenging anti-Jewish propaganda, ideology, Nazi propaganda. There is public protest by Jews. There is written protest in different forms. There's the disobedience of anti-Jewish laws and local restrictions. And then the most surprising is the last one, is physical self-defense against verbal or physical attacks. So I will share 1 or 2 stories of each kind of category with you now. So the first one is contesting Nazi propaganda. From the very beginning, we have the, police records, but also the testimonies of the USC Shoah Foundation show us that Jews kind of contested Nazi propaganda in various ways. They ripped down Nazi flags, they destroyed anti-Jewish signs and posters, they besmeared the display of anti-Semitic newspapers. And one story I found in the archive is especially interesting. This is the story of David Bornstein. He was living in Hamburg, and he was a merchant. He was 36 years old. And one day in the summer of 1936, he accompanied his wife to a bus terminal because she wanted to visit her parents-in-law. He was standing waiting for the departure of the bus. She was sitting inside, and he tried to kind of scratch or destroy the swastika, which was the logo on this public kind of transport, the bus. And I hope you can see this. There are 3 scratches on the swastika, which he kind of scratched with a walking stick, with a cane. And here is a very early example of historical reenactment. This is a Gestapo photo, and you see the man who tries to scratch or shows how to scratch the swastika is actually a Gestapo officer, so that's not David Bornstein. And the man in the window is not Bornstein's wife, this is the bus conductor who denunciated David Bornstein. So David Bornstein was arrested, was put on trial, and received 6 weeks in prison for just scratching the swastika logo. And later on, we find, even during the war, examples, for example, in Leipzig, where Jews also ripped down Nazi flags, still during the war. The next category is kind of protest in public. And this starts very early on. In 1933, there is a lot of kind of protest in public, critique of Jews against the first wave of terror, kind of by stormtroopers, the beating of Jews, some murder of Jews, but also the arrest of Jews and their internment in wild concentration camps in the beginning. So there are trials about the public critique by Jews. But then later, throughout the 1930s, we have Jewish women and men protesting against anti-Jewish laws in public, against Hitler in general, or against the regime. And one example is the case of Henriette Schäfer. She was like 60 years old and lived in a mixed marriage, and she experienced the Nazi pogrom Kristallnacht in 1938. And the next day, she went into a store, a shop, and she asked the store owner, and I quote, "What are you saying about the fact that everything is being destroyed and the synagogues are arsoned?" End of quote. The shop owner responded along the official Nazi propaganda lines, "Oh, this is the outrage of the German people because of the assassination of a German diplomat by a Jew in Paris." And then she said, quote, No, this is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scums, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. Her story is one of the chapters in the book. She received 6 months in prison for this comment. 6 months. And she received the 6 months under this law, the law against treacherous attacks against the Nazi state and the Nazi party. We thought this law was actually enacted in 1934 to quell resistance by communists and social democrats. But my research shows that it was widely applied against Jews. So even during the war, public kind of verbal protest in public didn't stop. For example, Hertha Reis was a 36-year-old Jewish woman. She was toiling as a forced laborer in Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, Berlin. And one day in 1941, in front of the Berlin courthouse, she exclaimed in front of passers-by, quote, We lost everything. Because of the damned government, we finally lost our home too. This thug Hitler, the damned government, the damned people, just because we are Jews, we are discriminated against. End of quote. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of her, but I want to share a picture of another woman who did something similar, insulting Hitler, protesting against the persecution in Vienna in 1942. And she received 6 months in prison too for these comments in public. So the next one is written protest. And here we see that from the very beginning, again, Jews protested in written form. The form which is widely known are petitions. So Jews petitioned like local authorities, the Nazi government, kind of ministries, the Nazi party, for exclusion from certain laws. But what we now know is, looking closer at these petitions, they also try to reclaim their identity as Jews, as Germans, as taxpayers, as contributors to the fatherland. So these were not just kind of petitions written in vain, they were important statements of protest. And this happened over the whole span of the Third Reich. But for example, in 1935 in Berlin, there were riots against Jews, and shop owners were kind of, or shops were attacked, and so Jewish shop owners would write petitions to the Berlin police president. But at the same time, some of the shop owners resorted to petitions. Some other Jews kind of distributed anonymous leaflets. And one of those is recorded here in this police report. That's not the actual leaflet, it's just a kind of report about the leaflet. But the leaflet said, and I quote, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler, exclamation mark." End of quote. And even during the war, these kind of written protests, anonymous leaflets, letters, petitions, never stopped. And one of the most striking examples is the one of Benno Neuburger, who was 71 years old. He was retired, he was a former real estate broker in Munich, and he saw his children leave Germany because they saw no future, but he could not get out of Germany with his wife. He only learned about the marriages of their children in the United States by letters. He didn't witness the birth of his grandchildren. And all of this kind of mounted to the moment when the Nazis introduced the notorious Yellow Star in 1941. This was kind of the straw which kind of broke the camel's back. He decided to kind of do something, and he used these Hitler post stamps, put them on postcards, and then he wrote insulting comments on them against Hitler. And this is how it looks like. So you see here, and really important is what he says is murderer, bandit Hitler on the one on the top. The left one, the eternal murderer Hitler, yeah? Disgusting, exclamation mark. And this is on the right is the most prophetic of all of them. It says murderer of 5 million. And this was before actually the knowledge kind of seeped through German channels about the ensuing mass murder in the East. So he made one mistake, and this is how the Gestapo got a hold of him. He used one postcard from his former real estate firm, and they arrested him, they tortured him, and I can say this because you see here, this is the mugshot, and when you look closer in the middle, you see that he has a bruise under his eye, so they definitely beat him up. However, he would not back down. He was, because the Nazis saw this as treason, he was brought to Berlin, to the Berlin People's Court, which was the most notorious, most anti-Semitic Nazi court in Berlin, and usually a court only for show trials. And there he was asked why he was doing these things, and he said, I did this because I hate Hitler, because of the persecution of the Jews, because of all these anti-Jewish laws, and because Hitler announced that he wants to exterminate the Jews. So even there, he was not backing down. The Nazis realized this, and he got the death penalty in the show trial, and he was decapitated in September 1942. Disobedience of laws and local restrictions. Throughout the whole time, Jews, men and women, young and old, kind of defied anti-Jewish regulations. You saw the picture of the bench. You heard the story of Hans Oppenheimer. So there was a lot of regulations which Jews kind of defied. For example, Jews were ordered to hand over precious metals, yeah, like jewelry and so on. Many Jews just didn't do it or hand over just a tiny part and kept the rest. They also were obliged to wear or adopt the discriminatory middle name Israel and Zara. You might have heard about this. What we never thought of was that the German name law actually requests that you need to fill out an application form for a name change. So in the archives, I found tons of evidence that Jews didn't apply or resisted to fill out these forms. So some Jews were even summoned to the police station and still resisted to adopt these kind of middle names. And some Jews got away with it, not recognized, for 2 years, like Ida Schneider, a 73-year-old woman in Leipzig. She received 7 months in prison for this crime of not adopting the discriminatory middle name Sarah. Jews refused to wear the yellow star. They were also punished for not wearing the yellow star with weeks or months in prison. And then Jews really defied local restrictions a lot. And just to share one story, this is Max Oppenheimer. He is a forced laborer during the war. And here is the only example of a diary which I found personally, where somebody speaks about his own individual act of resistance. And I quote, "My home is in a wooden hut behind a tool shed. From there I go to the public park, despite the 8 p.m. curfew and despite the ban to visit the park. On my way I count the signs with the slogan, 'Forbidden for Jews.' In total there are 6 signs. Later at 11 p.m. I rip the signs out of the ground and throw some of them in the bushes and some in the creek. However, all my courage proved futile. The next evening, all signs reappeared. For a second time, I did not have the courage. I'm just not a hero." End of quote. If you really think about what he says there, we can probably disagree with his characterization of himself, because it took a lot of courage actually to go back and to check what actually happened there, and he broke again like the restrictions, like the curfew and the not entering the public park. So, coming to the last point, physical self-defense. And this was the most surprising for me, actually, that individually Jews kind of defended themselves against either verbal insults or physical attacks. And interesting is here that most of them I didn't find actually in local archives. Most of what I know is from the testimonies, the interviews of the USC Shaw Foundation. And there's a reason, because physical altercations were not kind of something which broke the law. This was an altercation between 2 men or something like this. They were only recorded in the archive when there was a political context. So if some Jew would beat up a stormtrooper and say, "You're shitty Nazis," then this would be recorded. But if he would be silent, there was no offense. Yeah? So that's why physical self-defense almost left no traces in the archives. However, we know from some reports that those happened. So Jewish men defended their neighbors from harassment by Nazi stormtroopers. They beat up stormtroopers in the street. They, Jewish teenagers actually defended themselves against Hitler Youth members, neighborhood kids who kind of attacked them on their way home from school, or on the way to school. And interesting is here, I found 30 testimonies in the Shoah Foundation about these teenager altercations or brawls. And I thought surprising was that among these 30, 11 were actually girls who defended themselves, and not only against attacks by other girls, but attacks by other boys. And my most kind of favorite story is one of the interviewees said to me, said in the interview, not to me, but I watched it. So it says, she said, yeah, and after the third day, I was so fed up that I turned around and I kind of hit the most aggressive boy in the face and knocked his teeth out. So this was a really stunning kind of interview. So to share one even more remarkable story is the story of Daisy Grunovsky. So Daisy Grunovsky was 16 years old when Kristallnacht happened. So the program of November 1938, where stormtroopers raided Jewish shops, attacked Jewish homes, arson synagogues. They also raided so-called retraining camps. These were camps where Jewish organizations helped Jewish teenagers to get kind of agricultural skills to prepare them for emigration, for example, to Palestine. So Daisy Grunovsky was in one of these camps. Kristallnacht happened, stormtroopers raid the facilities, destroy the furniture in the lobby of this camp, and then let me share her story with you, and I'll explain something later. Oh, now there's no tone. Can we manage tone?
Yeah, I don't know, like, maybe the line's off the computer.
Oh, yeah.
And all of a sudden, they wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember one getting one on the back. That was it. I just walked through very slowly, looking at all of them. Now, here, big, tough guys. You want to hit a little girl. What can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one. I went back third. And I got to the end of the line. One of them grabs me, grabs this hand, the right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I learned a little trick. And that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him. And I started fighting. And I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand, I used the knife, I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his skull. I don't know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had told me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy, beaten up on it. So a couple of the guys saw it and they dragged him underneath a bed or some kind of a sofa type thing that hadn't been kicked over so the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, and he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off. We ran, all of us. And they started coming run after, didn't give up on it.
So just to kind of give you the context, so she was 16, the stormtroopers raided the facilities, they beat up the boys and then finally the girls. What she did there, she actually used a jiu-jitsu trick, which she had learned when she was like 13, 14 years old, back in Berlin, where she was member of a Hashomer Hatzair, Zionist leftist Jewish youth organization. So she was trained in self-defense, so to speak. She escapes from the camp with some of the friends. She gets actually, she's caught again a day after because she was sheltered by a friendly farmer whom they used to work for. She got arrested, then she escapes again. She kind of is sheltered in the monastery for some days, and then in the end, she managed to reach Cologne, where a big Jewish community was. And from there, she was put on a train to the Netherlands, and then she ended up in England and survived. So she is not only defending herself there, but she is really rebelling in various ways, escaping. And so she was a remarkable woman, and I think this shows that this type of resistance happens in places where we would never expect it, because we thought, for example, the overwhelming force of the Nazis doing this would not even allow such a thing. So let me come to the conclusion. 3 weeks after Nazi Germany invaded Poland, the 30-year-old Edith Britz wrote a letter that was intercepted by dem Stapel. The Jewish woman from Berlin described that one morning at 6 a.m., 2 police officers knocked on her door. She wrote in the letter, quote, "I'm so upset that I could attack anybody who wants to come into my pad. I will go crazy if there will be more. They stole my sleep, they stole everything from me," end of quote. And I think this citation kind of, in a way, conveys a level of anxiety and anger many Jews, young and old, have accumulated over time under this increasingly radical persecution. So when we define resistance as any individual or group actions, my research brings to light an enormous amount of incredible individual acts of defiance and protest. However, many more acts are still kind of remain unknown, because many archives I didn't touch, because I'm a one-man show, right? So I went to kind of a dozen local archives, but there are so many more in Germany. Second of all, as we learned from the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation, not every act of resistance was denunciated, so they didn't leave traces in the archives. So I think there is a large number of still to discover of these individual acts of resistance. As I shared, I think most of the individual acts can be subsumed under these 5 categories, which I shared with you. But important is to notice that there were no patterns. So it is not actually the case that these Jews who resisted had specific character traits, or that they had a special upbringing, or a special education. You find blue-collar workers and doctors. You find men and women. You find teenagers and elderly people. You find kind of people from all walks of life. So I think that's one of the most stunning revelations of my research, because it shows that actually any individual is capable of resisting. Not special people. In this regard, everybody is special. And they did it in a variety of very interesting and surprising ways, as the beginning story of Hans Hoppenheimer showed. And I think people at the time knew this. And so, for example, Rabbi Max Nussbaum from Berlin, he recalled in the 1960s, and I quote, "We were besieged in 100 of different manners, and therefore we fought back in 100 of different manners," end of quote. Some might question if these small acts really are resistance, right? But I would say it is not up to the public, it's not up to me as a scholar actually, or even the survivors to kind of tell what resistance is. In the end, it were the perpetrators, the Nazis, who defined what resistance is, because what they perceived as a threat, that's what they tried to punish with prison sentences, incarceration, and so on. Sometimes even with the death penalty. So I think we need to rethink how we think about resistance, and need to incorporate this into our general kind of narrative of the Holocaust. And I think this is not only applicable to Germany. You can probably find similar instances in other countries like France, Poland, the Netherlands, and so on. So understanding Jewish men and women as historical actors renders all claims of their passivity obsolete, and I hope once and for all. Thank you.
Resistors among them.
Anything you're curious about? It doesn't have to be like, yes.
When you were talking about physical acts of resistance, you said something that if they didn't say anything about like Nazi or putting it down, that they wouldn't get in trouble. Is that true? That they wouldn't get in trouble at all, or they just wouldn't go to jail?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Please repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, I mentioned when I talked about physical self-defense, that most of these cases did not leave traces in the archives unless they had some political context, when they would call kind of somebody a dirty Nazi or something. And so in some cases there were repercussions, but not with jail time in this regard. So there were no trials, because they didn't break the law in this regard. Only if they insulted the regime, then this law, which kind of came to fruition, which I showed in 1934.
Which type of resistance was the most common and why?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's the question, well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. The question was which one of the 5 different categories was the most common and why?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, from my sources, I would say the most common was verbal protests. Yeah? Speaking out, insulting Hitler, protesting against anti-Jewish legislation. However, I say this with a little bit of hesitation, because it may also be the cause of my sources. Because these kind of insults or kind of the critique towards the regime was always prosecuted and left traces in the archives. So, for example, the destruction of Nazi insignia, ripping down Nazi flags, that's actually much harder to detect because it takes a second and no witnesses. Because verbal protest is denunciated if somebody hears it, right? You say something and usually you address somebody and say, this is like the woman in the shop. So there are witnesses. But ripping down a Nazi flag, you could do this in the, kind of in the dark at night and might get away with it because nobody witnesses. So there might have been way more in this regard, which I didn't see in the archives. Yeah? The same is true for the physical altercations. I know about this from the testimonies of the Shaw Foundation, but there may have been also way more than this. Yeah? Because what I learned now after thinking about this, and I was struck by Daisy Grunovsky and her self-defense training, I assumed that actually more Jewish teenagers were trained in self-defense. And so they might have also defended themselves, right? But we don't know about it because it didn't leave traces. So that's a little bit kind of a hesitation I have too. But I think verbal protest is probably the most common form. Or, now I'm kind of, I think disobedience of laws actually is also very widespread.
Were there any famous protests within the Nazi government where they essentially tried to sabotage the Nazi regime or government?
So the question was, if I understood correctly, if there was resistance in the Nazi government or Nazi administration against the persecution of the Jews, to try to slow it down. So that's also a very interesting question. So there was, but for different reasons. So for example, I mentioned that cities were often initiative in enacting anti-Jewish regulations, like access to public facilities, or cutting ties with Jewish businesses. And there was in the beginning the Ministry of Economy actually against these kind of local initiatives. So they would intervene against those because they thought this would be a disruption of the economy. So there were economic reasons for this. Then you have individuals in various administrations on different levels who didn't execute anti-Jewish regulations or didn't follow what their superior were ordering. There are individual kind of some examples, not many, but interesting is here that those examples we know of, they actually had no real big repercussions. Because after the war, the Germans said, oh, we couldn't do anything. If we would have done anything, then it would have been grave for us. We would have been thrown in jail. That's actually not really what happened. When you were in an administration, in the city government, the worst what happened was you would be removed from your post and put into another position, which no kind of, let's say, which was more in the back than in the front, but not much more. Yeah. So I think, but what I learned from my research by coincidence, because I was focusing on Jewish resistance, is that actually quite a lot of non-Jewish Germans were also protesting against the persecution of the Jews, which is something also what we didn't, were aware of, because we always thought, or the general opinion is, there were the Nazi kind of core, and then there was a lot of the German population was indifferent. But that's actually not possible in a dictatorship to be indifferent. You have to make decisions every day. And so what I learned from my research is quite a lot of non-Jewish Germans went to jail for speaking up in favor of Jews. Yeah, so that's also changing a little bit how we see kind of the overall spectrum of the German population. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh.
So you mentioned like these databases, like these sources. I can't imagine you also like a countless amount more that you've heard of? Like, how did you choose which ones to share with us today?
When I start, so the question was, sorry, the question was that I talked about several databases which I used for my research and how I came to them and how I chose my sources, right? So I have to say, I came to this topic by coincidence. So the beginning was I was sitting in a Berlin archive. I was working on the persecution of the Jews for quite some years, and there was one source I always wanted to have a look at, and these were police logbooks. That means police diaries from local precincts in Berlin. And in Berlin, from 300 precincts, like 10%, they are survived diaries. So what every policeman would kind of write down on a daily basis about stolen bicycles, kind of drunk people, exhibitionists, kind of besmearing facades, walls, right? And there, when I went through this, because I thought I would find some stuff about the persecution of the Jews, I found this first note, just a few lines about the arrest of a Jew for public protest. So this kind of, in a way, woke me up and said, I never came across this kind of way of speaking up in public. And then I thought I need to really follow through and really investigate this. So I thought, what will happen to somebody who is arrested? What will they do with him? So I thought about maybe he went on trial. Then I went to Berlin court records, and in the meantime I had found dozens of other Jewish arrests in these police logbooks. So I took the names, went through the court files, and tried to find the names of these people. But I was totally unsuccessful. None of them appeared in these court files. However, in the court files I found other instances of public protests of Jews. So suddenly I had even more. So this then led me to think about, is this just Berlin, right? The capital of the Third Reich, a city of several million people. Maybe it is easier for Jews to resist there than maybe in a smaller town. So I went then to other cities, to the local archives, and used the same sources, like police records and court records, because I knew this is where I can find these types of resistance. And I found more. And then I realized not only I find more, I find a larger variety beyond just public protest. And then it's just systematically going through files. Yeah? So there's nothing which points you to this file, there's resistance. You have to go through these files, like this takes months and years. I worked 12 years on this. Yeah? And the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation was a little bit easier, because these interviews, they are for between 1 hour and 6 hours long, maybe. These are interviews where the Jews the survivors are talking about their lives, they ask questions, and the Shoah Foundation did one very smart thing in the beginning. They indexed every minute of these interviews. So in total you have like 12 years of interviews. To organize this, they have kind of keywords for every minute. And so I looked up the keyword resistance. Nothing came up. So I said, the only thing what came up was like this old, the traditional form of resistance, armed resistance, partisans, ghetto uprisings, but none of this what I was interested in, individual. Then I found the keyword defiance, and I thought, oh, defiance, maybe that's it. Strangely, the same stuff came up under resistance, only partisans and ghetto uprising. And then I talked to the curator of the archive and said, can you help me? How, this is what I'm interested in. How can I come close to this? And then he kind of revealed that there's a term which I can try to use, which was self-preservation. And I put this keyword in the search engine of the archive, and suddenly I found the story of Daisy Godowski and of many other people of the teenagers kind of defending themselves against the schoolmates and so on. Yeah. So that's kind of how I found my sources.
Any more student questions? No? Okay, so anyone from the adult area want to ask a question? Post-adult. Because most of the kids here are adults.
Well, I was among the first or second generation of historians of the Holocaust. And for me, certainly, the idea of Jewish resistance would have been a contradiction in terms. The response would be the expectation that they would hide or escape. And also the term, not mine, but much used, going to their death like sheep to the slaughter and so on. And that first generation, second generation, they were concerned with the German records, the Nazi party, etc., Gestapo, and what have you. And it was a revelation to me when I came upon the importance of looking at the railroad documents. They played an indispensable role. Without the railroads, only half of the Holocaust. And there is a sense of progression in Holocaust studies. The archives, the material that you use, you couldn't, even if you were looking for them, you couldn't find them. They weren't accessible. So there's this kind of progress in Holocaust studies, and you were the beneficiary of those first, second, third, you're possibly the fourth, fifth generation of Holocaust, of historians, of historians of the Holocaust. I don't think there's ever going to be an end.
No.
It's inexhaustible. We will throw further light and so on. And I must say, for me, this has been an illumination, both for the study of the Holocaust and for my own experience personally.
Thank you.
Well, he has to travel to South Africa tomorrow on a book tour, so I don't want to keep him too late. And thank you everyone for coming. If you haven't signed up, please, so you can get our email. Come to our events. We have dinners, we have great events, and we have amazing speakers like Wolf. Yeah, if you can fill out the evaluations about what you thought of the event, that would be great. So we can always